it takes several pages. At the end of the book, I do have this whole section where I said, well, what actually happened? And for Truman, when he found out he won, the first thing he said is labor did it. Labor unions had helped him win the election. Dewey was insistent, and the way he wrote about it in his letters to his family and his friends after the election, in letter after letter, he said it over and over, is that farmers did him in. Farmers traditionally voted for the Republicans, and they didn't. They voted for Truman. Why? Because Truman had come up a farmer, and there's some other more complicated reasons. But the fascinating part about it, to me, is the absolute excitement that really enveloped the Truman campaign in the last 3 weeks of its existence. And all of the documentation exists, so you can really dig in and bring it to life. For example, the Truman Library has dozens and dozens of oral histories of people who were on the campaign train. Margaret Truman wrote a memoir. She wrote a biography of her dad. She wrote a biography of her mom, and she kept a diary during the election, which I have. So all of these kinds of, excuse me, plus the regular documentation that the president was, that was crossing his desk every day. Through all of that, you can really bring to life the excitement of that campaign in the last 3 weeks. And really what it came down to was Mr. Truman himself. He won the election through pure determination, charisma, and confidence that what he was fighting for was the right thing, morally and politically.
What were specific things that he staked his claim as being the moral choice? Were they things you mentioned earlier, like desegregation or foreign policy issues? What did he do to set himself apart from Dewey?
Well, three things. Well, the question was easy to answer right up until the last four words you mentioned. So civil rights, support for Israel, which was very complicated, and also just the whole idea. He staked his campaign as a race not against Dewey because, again, on a lot of these major policies, such as civil rights, Dewey and Truman agreed. But what Truman fought against was the Republican-controlled Congress, which was far more conservative, the 80th Congress. So he went on this amazing train tour into all of these tiny towns. Sometimes he'd be out there at sunrise, literally giving speeches in his pajamas. He was becoming a folk hero by being this man who went into these communities where politicians usually didn't go, small towns, and people would come from miles and miles, huge crowds in these rural places. And he would speak to them genuinely and explain to them that the United States government did not belong to him. It belonged to the people, the voters. The American dream belonged to them. He was a servant to them, not the other way around. And what they had to do was vote for their best interests. And basically the way he put it was the Republican-controlled 80th Congress was going to always vote for all of these programs that were not in their best interest. They were going to be listening to the real estate lobbyists. They were going to be listening to Wall Street and big business. And Wall Street was going to benefit over everyday Americans. That was his message, and it worked.
The subtitle of your book is The Battle for America's Soul. So presumably it's a battle that was won. Spoiler alert, Truman did win the 1948 election. So I'm sorry if I ruined that for anyone out there. But how do you see that as a victory for America's soul and the positive outcome of this?
That's a very interesting point. And one thing, the epigraph, right? The first thing that you read when you open the book are two quotes. One says, every vital question of state will be merged in the question, who will be the next president? That's Alexander Hamilton. And then there's a quote from Truman speaking on October 25th, 1948, so less than 2 weeks before Election Day. And he says, it is not just a battle between two parties. It is a fight for the very soul of the American government. So that's sort of where that idea came from. That was him speaking. But, I wouldn't say, it's interesting to think of the election as a positive outcome. It was a positive outcome for Truman. And one of the really interesting Monday morning quarterback things to think about is what would have happened if Dewey won. And the copy editor I worked with at my publisher, Houghton Mifflin, she, in an email at one point, she said that she was going to wear a Dewey hat while she was doing her work because she was a Republican, which I think is wonderful. But because these two guys, in a way, were agreed on many of the major issues, it's kind of strange to think about it as a fight for the soul of America. Because really what it was Truman was fighting again against the 80th Congress. But if Dewey had become president as everybody believed would happen, how would America be different? And that is just maybe not at all, maybe very little. It's an interesting thought.
So I'm curious what your take is on the legacy of Truman. What does he accomplish in the second term? But moreover, what does a Truman fan say today? It seems like he's someone that he doesn't have fans the way FDR does, where he was a folk hero for decades, and to those who grew up in the World War II generation and the silent generation. Truman, not so much. Although I did once have a guest on this podcast whose favorite president was John Tyler, the 10th president. So that's major points for originality right there. And I have noticed that in the C-SPAN presidential ranking, I think Truman's been creeping up over the years. So he seems to be getting some type of new recognition. And I think Charles Crothamer, after George W. Bush left the office, he was a conservative commentator. And he argued that George W. Bush, history would see he did the right thing. And he compared him to Harry Truman, who had the same treatment. Who knows will that happen or not? But yeah, so what happened in his second term, and what's sort of the afterlife of Harry Truman for those that think he was a good president?
Well, I mean, the main thing that happened in the second term is Korea. And one point I can make is that Thomas Dewey and surprisingly Henry Wallace, both of them, reached out to Truman during the early days of the Korean War and said that they agreed with his decision. I mean, this was very controversial. Both of them, Dewey and Wallace, reached out and said, I would have done the same thing if I were president. But, Truman had a rocky second term. And when he left office, his approval ratings were not good at all. And he went back and lived quietly in independence and went for his walks. And when he passed away, he wasn't. But so why is it that he's been creeping up? It's so interesting, You can go on YouTube right now and see a hard right guy like Judge Roy Moore on the campaign trail quoting Harry Truman, who was very much a liberal. How does that happen? Donald Trump, in front of the United Nations General Assembly, the first time he addressed the UN, I think, he quoted Truman. So why is it that all of these politicians, whether you're on the right, the left, or the center, why do they all love Truman? And I think the answer to that, there's two answers. One is that this was a guy who was like an everyday American. And so his ascendancy is something that any American can identify and dream about, because we all dream. Some people look at video of Metallica and dreaming of themselves playing guitar on the stage. And some people look at football and say they dream of themselves being the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers. And this was a guy who achieved the highest levels of success, who earned everything about it. There was nothing of privilege in his early life that would let anybody believe that he would have achieved what he achieved, and yet he did. Now, the second thing I would have to say is that a lot of people look back on the history of our country and identify the Truman years as the last sort of era of true American greatness, when the moral leadership of our country could not be questioned. We were sacrosanct. We were always doing the right thing, or at least that's the impression. Once Korea came, things changed. And wars happened. You could never compare Korea or Vietnam to World War II. Anybody would say, well, World War II was truly a battle of good and evil and nothing else. It was that's what it was. But after that war, a lot of people look back on our country's history and see the identity of our nation changing, and not necessarily in a good way. So the Truman era is remembered as this sacrosanct era. That's my theory anyway.
Well, one last question to tie this together, and I think Harry Truman can speak to something that we're going to encounter much more in the future. And the question is, what sort of experience actually makes for a good president, or does experience even matter? I mean, a few administrations ago, election cycles ago, there was the big argument about experience. Is this candidate experienced enough to be president? With Donald Trump, now the question's mostly gone because he had no political experience. The only other president who had none was Eisenhower, and he was Supreme Allied Commander, and that's a little bit different. And now with this recording in late February 2020, Michael Bloomberg is in the Democratic Party, and maybe he couldn't have made it this last election cycle because he was only a mayor, but now that question seems moot. So we're entering this new era where what it means to have experience is a very different thing from what it was a few election cycles ago. Harry Truman came into office without the traditional experience that many would expect of a president. So based on looking at him, comparing him to other people, what makes for a good president? I mean, is there any kind of experience, if not political experience, that you think could prepare someone to be a good president?
That's an excellent question. And I think the only way to answer it is you never know until you're looking at it at a presidency in retrospect. It's the same sort of scenario you would say if you took, an unproven quarterback. Again, I'm not a crazy football fan, but it seems like an apt metaphor, and put him in a quarterback and he's never played in the NFL, and maybe he'll be great and maybe he won't. And if he's not great, you can say, he didn't have any experience. But if he is, it's inexplicable. And those inexplicable success stories are our favorite success stories because they're so unexpected. But another point I can make is that Truman, he was widely seen as very obscure and very inexperienced. At the same time, he had served 2 terms in the Senate, and he had a pretty good understanding of how things worked on Capitol Hill. So he didn't really have a lot of executive experience, and yet he knew how power functioned in the Capitol. He knew who controlled it and how it was leveraged. So I think that kind of stuff helped him immeasurably. But really, ultimately, his success, I think, it was just a matter of character. He had it. And America agreed. That's why he won. But as you go forward, who knows who becomes president next? And we'll never know until that presidency is over, whether that president will be a great president, a good president, a bad president. And we'll all be dissecting that president for generations to come, dissecting the presidency, I should say. Mm-hmm. And, coming up with our own theories of why he was or she was successful or why not.
Definitely, much like we've done here. Well, there's a lot more to unpack, but listeners can do that if they check out your book, which is Dewey Defeats Truman, the 1948 election and the battle for America's soul. AJ, thank you for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, so that is all for the episode today. As always, I'd like to kick things off by thanking the Spy Masters for History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Baron Fraza, Chris C., David Santee, the McRaes, Jake Harrington, Jennifer French Lee, Josh Reddick, Carl from Norway, Michael from New York, Nick Brooks, Rob from Chicago, Ryan Gillen, Tom from Ohio, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tyler from Colorado, and Bill Ivey. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also, I have exclusive content there, such as live streams where I do live versions of podcast episodes where you can leave feedback as I'm talking, and I will address it on air. Last, and I think this is the best, is to join our membership program, the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers were George Washington's spies during the Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program for History Unplugged. If you go to patreon.com/unplugged, you can join the membership program at 3 levels. If you join at the Scout level, you'll get all 400 episodes of History Unplugged